Liam Falcone was 37 years old when he stopped believing he was untouchable. He was the third-generation boss of the Falcone family, the most feared man on Chicago's North Side, a man who'd built an empire on iron rules, in cold or silence 40 men under his command, 6 legitimate businesses as fronts, and a peace treaty with the South Side that had held for 8 straight years because nobody was foolish enough to cross him. He had the mansion in Lake Forest, the beautiful wife who smiled for the cameras, and a best friend he'd trusted since they were 2 shoeshine boys hustling on Taylor Street. Then, on the night of his 6th wedding anniversary, his heart gave out in his own bathroom, and 4 days later, Liam Falcone lay inside a walnut casket in his family's private chapel, listening to the Latin prayers of his own funeral. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He couldn't lift a single finger. The doctors called it sudden cardiac failure. The whole underworld called it death. But Liam was inside that box, hearing everything: his brother weeping, his captains kissing the ring one last time, the lilies growing thick and sweet in the air above him. And then 2 sets of footsteps stopped beside the casket. A hand rested on the wood, and his wife Renata's voice, low, warm, meant for one man only, whispered, "Thank you for making it look like a heart attack." The voice that answered froze his blood colder than the poison they'd slipped into his wine, because it belonged to Carmen Russo, his underboss, his best man, the brother he'd have died for. And then Renata laughed softly against her lover's shoulder and breathed the words that would echo in the dark long after the organ went quiet. No one will ever know she was wrong. Because in that grand, cold house full of people who bowed and lied and looked the other way, there was one person nobody ever bothered to see: a 26-year-old maid named Luna Hartley, newly pregnant and silently grieving a fiancé who died in a so-called accident, a girl who scrubbed the floors of the Falcone estate and had already stumbled onto the one secret that could get her killed. That night, while the widow toasted champagne upstairs, Luna knelt beside the casket to whisper a confession of her own and saw the dead man's finger move. What happened next would drag a maid and a mafia boss into an alliance neither of them chose, unravel a betrayal 18 months in the making, and prove that the most dangerous person in any empire isn't the man with the gun, it's the woman. Everyone looked straight through. If you're already hooked, hit that like button so this story reaches someone else who needs it tonight. Share it with a friend who loves a comeback nobody saw coming. And subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow's story might be the one you never forget. Now let's go back to the beginning, back to last ordinary Thursday of Liam Falcone's life. Before the wine, before the whisper, before the coffin, when the king of Chicago's North Side still believed the two Plutzelklugs to him would take a bullet for him, never once imagining they'd be the ones to load it. The scent of old leather and cigar smokes was the first thing to touch Liam Falcone when he pushed open the door of the restaurant on Taylor Street that Thursday evening. The smell had been there since his father's time, soaked into the walls, into the deep red leather booths, into the velvet curtain that separated the private dining room in the back. And Liam had always believed that as long as that scent remained unchanged, his world remained unchanged as well. The doorman bowed his head. The old waiter polishing glasses stopped his hand and lowered his eye toward the counter. The head chef leaned out through the kitchen doorway, then quietly withdrew. No one greeted him loudly. No one dared greet him loudly. In Liam's world, silence was the ritual, and bowed heads said more than any words of praise ever could. He walked slowly down the aisle between rows of white tablecloths, his fingers brushing the backs of the chairs, the way a man might glide his hand across the familiar keys of a piano, stopping at the table in the farthest corner where his father once sat, the place where Liam now settled every Thursday evening, ordered a glass of red wine he never drank beyond half, and listened to the manager's report. It was a ritual. Every empire needed rituals, and the man at the head of an empire needed them more than anyone, because ritual was how he told the entire city that everything was still moving according to order. That evening, everything appeared to be in order. The manager placed a leather-bound ledger on the table, turned each page with fingers that trembled slightly, and read the figures in a steady voice. Weekly revenue, wine purchasing costs, payroll. Liam listened with only half his intentions until one number made his finger pause against the rim of his glass. A small discrepancy, a very small one, buried beneath consulting fees, the kind of thing another man might have overlooked as easily as a speck of dust on his lapel. But Liam wasn't another man. He asked about it in a low voice, no louder than the music playing in the background, and the manager swallowed hard before saying the charge had come down from the main office, that it carried an authorized signature, that everything was legitimate. An authorized signature. Liam nodded slowly, and for one very brief moment, his memory drifted toward a name he hadn't thought about in weeks. Tommy Ward. The 27-year-old accountant with thin-framed glasses and a tie that always sat slightly crooked, who had once stood outside Liam's office on an afternoon about 4 months earlier, clutching a folder to his chest and asking for 5 private minutes because there was something important he needed to present in person. Liam had been occupied with a call to the West Coast and told him to come back the following week. 2 days later, word came that Tommy had died in a car accident on the highway during a rainstorm. A death so ordinary that no one spoke of it for more than 3 days. Liam had sent a wreath. He had signed a form allowing someone on the household staff to take several days off to attend her fiancé's funeral, some maid whose face and name he couldn't even remember, though he vaguely recalled the slanted handwriting on her request and the stroke of his own pen approving it. Then he forgot. The man who ruled an empire had no room in his mind for matters like that. He took a sip of wine. He told himself the discrepancy was nothing more than a counting error, decided he would have someone review it the following week, and closed the ledger before returning it to the manager. On the drive back to Lake Forest, rain began tapping softly against the car windows, and Liam called his wife to tell her he would be home later than usual. The phone rang 4 times. When Renata answered, he heard, in that first fleeting instant, another voice abruptly fall silent in the background, like a door being hurriedly closed, and then her voice came through, smooth and sweet, asking whether he had eaten dinner and reminding him to drive carefully because of the rain. He asked who had just been there with her. She laughed softly and told him it was only the television, darling, that she had been watching a movie. Liam said all right and let the matter drift past him the way he let a leaf slide across the windshield. Men in his position were taught to suspect an entire city, but no one ever taught him how to suspect his own home. By the time he reached the mansion, most of the lights along the first-floor corridor had been turned off, and he paused for a second before the wedding photograph hanging beside the staircase, the one taken 6 years earlier, with Renata in her white gown resting her head against his shoulder while they both smiled. He realized he passed that photograph every day, yet it had been a very long time since he had truly looked at it, the way people stopped looking at a clock on the wall once they knew its rhythm by heart. That night, he went to bed early, his back turned toward the empty half of the mattress, because Renata said she still had work to finish downstairs. He didn't hear what time she came to the bedroom. He didn't know that at the far end of the property, inside the servants' quarters, a young woman was lying awake through the entire night, with nausea twisting through her body and a nameless fear lodged inside her chest. He also didn't know that only 1 week until his 6th wedding anniversary, the king of the North Side fell asleep inside his own fortress, certain that every door had been locked, every number would eventually balance, and every person beneath that roof belonged to him. He was right about the doors. He was only wrong about the people. At 4:30 in the morning, while the entire Lake Forest mansion still lay submerged in darkness and the most powerful man on the North Side remained asleep behind securely locked doors, Luna Hartley sat up on the narrow bed in the servants' quarters at the far end of the property. She remained still for a full minute, both hands resting over her stomach, waiting for the first wave of nausea to rise and recede like the tide, a private ritual she had taught herself to endure in silence for many weeks. When the sickness became too much to bear, she didn't dare use the shared bathroom for fear the noise might wake someone, so she quietly slipped out through the rear passage and made her way to the gardening shed, where the smell of damp soil and fertilizer had, with cruel irony, become the only place she was allowed to be weak. She retched into a galvanized bucket, rinsed her mouth with the bottle of water she had brought, leaned against a wooden shelf for several seconds until the dizziness passed, then smoothed her apron and entered the main house at exactly 10 minutes before 5, as though nothing had happened. No one could know. A pregnant maid was a maid about to lose her job, and she couldn't lose hers, because inside the wooden drawer beneath her bed lay a stack of hospital debt notices, $30,000 in medical bills, from the final months of her mother's life. Figures that still hadn't been paid when the woman closed her eyes, and now that belonged to Luna, her only child, like an inheritance made of bricks and stone, her heads upon her shoulders. Every morning, while dusting the second-floor hallway, she passed the wedding photograph beside the staircase that the master of the house had long since stopped seeing, and by habit she touched delicate chain hidden beneath the collar of her uniform, where Tommy's thin silver engagement ring rested against her chest, warmed by the heat of her own body. The ring he had bought with 3 months of savings and placed in her hand at a small diner, with the promise that they only had to endure 1 more year, and then they would have enough money to leave this place. He hadn't been given a year. He hadn't even been given a week. She didn't allow herself to think beyond that, because thinking meant crying, and tears were a luxury she couldn't afford in this house. That afternoon, the mistress summoned her to the grand sitting room. Renata Falcone sat on a cream velvet sofa with one leg crossed over the other, turning a glass of red wine slowly in her hand, beautiful in a cold, lifeless way, like a statue carved from ice, and the moment Luna bowed in greeting, the glass tilted with deliberate slowness, allowing the dark red wine to spread across the ivory Persian rug. "Oh," Renata said in a voice as smooth as silk. "You're so clumsy, you startled me. Clean it." Luna knelt and cleaned it. When the stain was gone, Renata narrowed her eyes to inspect the rug, then said she could still see a shadow and ordered her to clean it again. Luna cleaned it again. By the 3rd time, when her knees had gone numb against the carpet and the smell of wine surged into her nose, twisting her stomach painfully, Renata finally stood, walked past her, and, as though by accident, let a mink coat slip from her hand and fall to the floor directly in front of Luna. "Pick it up, hang it in the dressing room, don't let it gather dust," she said without even turning around. Then she paused in the doorway, the sound of her heels stopping for a single beat, and her voice drifted back as lightly as someone brushing away a speck of dust. "By the way, you've been moving rather heavily lately. That belly of yours is starting to become unpleasant to look at in this house. If I were you, I'd have the sense to make arrangements before someone else has to make them for me." The door closed. Luna remained kneeling in the vast sitting room, clutching a soft fur coat worth 10 years of her wages, and for 1 second she allowed her spine to bend beneath the weight of it all. Only 1 second, then she straightened again. The only person who witnessed that moment was Marta, the elderly housekeeper who had served in the mansion since the time of the former master, standing silently in the kitchen doorway with a tray in her hands. That evening, while Luna was finishing the last of a bowl of cold soup in the servants' kitchen, Marta placed a steaming plate of stew in front of her, taken from the upstairs meal, along with a glass of warm milk, then sat in the chair across from her and said nothing for a long while. "Eat," she finally said, her voice low and rough. "You have to eat for 2 now." Luna looked up in alarm, but the old woman only shook her head and placed one wrinkled hand over hers. "I've worked in houses like this for 40 years, child. I can tell by the way a woman walks. Don't be afraid. My lips are sealed as tightly as a grave. But listen to me," she added, lowering her voice until it was little more than a breath, her eyes shifting toward the dark hallway that led to the upper floors. "In this house, there's only one thing you need to remember. Never let that woman know what you've seen or heard, no matter what it is." The spoon in Luna's hand stopped halfway to her mouth. Her gaze drifted instinctively through the kitchen window, across the lawn beneath the night sky, toward the silent black shape of the boathouse beside the water, and the ring beneath the fabric of her uniform suddenly felt as heavy as a stone crushing her chest. Because she had seen something, she had seen it 4 months earlier, and she had begun to believe that what she witnessed that night had taken away the only person in the world who had ever promised to carry her away from this place. That night had been 4 months earlier, an early spring night heavy with dampness, with wet wind blowing in from the lake, and whenever the memory returned, Luna could still remember exactly how happy she had been as she walked across the dark lawn toward the boathouse, because that afternoon, inside the restroom of a small drugstore, 2 bus rides away from the mansion, she had stood trembling as the test in her hand revealed 2 red lines, and for hours afterward she had moved through her work as though her feet no longer touched the ground, her lips curving into smiles on their own, her hand constantly drifting toward her stomach, her thoughts circling only one thing: how she would tell Tommy, whether she should wait until he came to pick her up that Sunday, or wrap the test in a small gift box and make him open it himself, just so she could watch the face behind those thin-framed glasses go blank with disbelief 3 whole seconds before joy broke across it. She had almost called him that very evening. She had entered half his number, then stopped, telling herself news like this had to be shared face to face, that they had to look into each other's eyes, and it was only 2 more days. Only 2 more days. Later, there were nights when she lay biting hard into her pillow to keep from making a sound, simply because those 4 words repeated inside her mind like a sentence being handed down. That night, the cook had sent her to carry a stack of clean towels to the boathouse because the family had guests arriving early the next morning for a yacht outing, and Luna crossed the dew-soaked lawn with the towels in her arms, still floating in the happiness of those 2 red lines. So she didn't notice until she was almost at the door that yellow light was spilling through the gaps in the boards and voices were coming from inside. A woman's laughter, low and soft, the kind of laughter Luna had never once heard from the mistress in the 2 years she had worked in that house, followed by a deep male voice so familiar that she recognized it immediately, the voice of Mr. Carmine Russo, the man everyone in the household called Uncle Carmine, the man who sat every month at the chair to the master's right, the man who put an arm around his shoulders and called him brother. Luna had meant to turn away the instant she heard them. She had already taken half a step backward, but the boathouse door had been left slightly open, and through the gap, wide enough beneath the yellow pool of light, she saw Renata Falcone standing securely inside Carmine Russo's arms, one hand resting against his chest, her loosened hair falling over his shoulder, in a position that couldn't be misunderstood, couldn't be explained away, intimate in the way only 2 people who had belonged to each other for a very long time could be. A towel slipped from the top of the stack and fell to the ground. It was only a faint sound, but in the stillness of the night, it rang out like a gunshot, and by the time Luna bent to pick it up, the door had opened wide. Renata stood there without embarrassment, without panic, without even the slightest startle, merely crossing her arms and looking Luna up with the expression someone might use while deciding the value of a chipped piece of porcelain. Luna stammered an apology and said the cook had sent her with the towels, that she hadn't seen anything, and that final sentence was the mistake, because it admitted there had been something she wasn't supposed to see. Renata descended the wooden steps slowly, her heels striking each board with deliberate calm, coming so close that Luna could smell perfume mixed with red wine on her breath. Then she tilted her head and studied Luna for a long moment as though examining an insect. "You're a maid, child," she said in the smoothest, gentlest voice Luna had ever heard. "Your words are garbage, and no one ever bends down to listen to garbage speak. But remember this," she continued, leaning closer until her voice became an icy breath against Luna's ear. "If garbage learns how to talk, people burn it." Then she straightened, smiled, told Luna to place the towels neatly in the cabinet, and turned back inside, closing the door behind her, leaving Luna rooted to the lawn with the stack of towels clutched against her chest like a useless shield, her heart pounding so hard it hurt beneath her ribs. 2 days later, on the very day she had planned to tell Tommy that he was going to be a father, the phone in her apron pocket vibrated just before noon. She did not know that her dropped towel had sealed Tommy's fate. Carmine and Renata had already been watching Tommy, suspicious of his questions about the accounts. Seeing Luna at the boathouse made them realize the 2 lovers held all the cards to destroy them, to paralyze Luna with terror and ensure her absolute silence while simultaneously shutting down the audit. They chose to strike Tommy first, staging his death as a warning she would never forget. It was an unfamiliar number. A dry male voice introduced himself as a highway patrol officer and asked whether she was the emergency contact listed for Thomas Ward. Then he told her Tommy had died on the rain-slick highway early that morning. His car had skidded out of its lane and struck the median. He had died instantly. He hadn't suffered, they said, as though that were supposed to comfort her. She couldn't remember what she said in response. She only remembered the silver tray falling from her hands and crashing on the marble floor. And she remembered that the joyful news she had carried in her chest, the news she had protected for 2 days, while waiting for the perfect moment to give it, would never reach the person who most needed to hear it. He had died without knowing. That was the thorn lodged deepest inside her. deeper even than the grief of becoming a widow before she had ever become a wife. The knowledge that Tommy had closed his eyes without ever knowing he was about to be a father. His funeral was small and sparsely attended. She requested 3 days off in a handwritten note sent to the master's office and received it back with the approving signature of a man who had never known who she was. Then she returned to work, dusting, ironing clothes, folding towels, moving through the house like a shadow, while inside her mind the two events remained side by side, refusing to separate. The night at the boathouse and the morning on the highway only 48 hours apart. She had no proof. Tommy's car had been old, the weather had been rainy, the road had been slick. The police had reached their conclusion, the file had been closed. And who in this world would believe a maid claiming that the death of an insignificant accountant was connected to the mistress of one of the most feared families in Chicago? Luna herself didn't dare believe it completely. To believe completely meant she would have to do something, and doing something would get her killed, and the baby inside her would die with her. So she chose to keep living with a question rather than die for an answer. But every night, after the mansions went dark, and she curled on the narrow bed with one hand resting over the child who would never know a father, the question crawled out of the darkness again, slow and merciless, never growing tired. If she hadn't dropped that towel that night, if Renata hadn't seen her face, would Tommy still be alive now? 1 week after that Thursday night, the Lake Forest mansion had been glowing with light since dusk, for the 6th anniversary celebration of its master and mistress, and Liam Falcone stood at the top of the staircase in a custom-tailored black suit, looking down into the grand hall, where the most powerful people from both of Chicago's worlds, the world of light and the world of shadows, were raising their glasses beneath crystal chandeliers. Renata descended behind him in a deep wine-red gown, her hair swept high to reveal a strand of pearls against her pale throat, so beautiful that the entire room seemed to pause for half a heartbeat, and when she slipped her arm through her husband's and walked between the 2 rows of guests, Liam briefly thought that perhaps all the distance he had felt lately was only because he had been working too much. That tonight they would talk, they would begin again, that 6 years was a long road, and people had the right to grow tired somewhere along the way. Carmen Russo arrived 10 minutes late, as he always did, embraced Liam like a brother, struck him twice on the back, made a joke that sent half the room into laughter, then blended into the crowd with a glass of whiskey in his hand, moving as naturally as though this house belonged to him too. Which, in truth, was exactly how Liam had always wanted him to feel after all those years. Halfway through the party, Renata lightly tapped a silver spoon against the rim of her glass, and the clear ringing sound drew every gaze toward her. Before all the assembled guests, she raised her glass of red wine and said in a warm voice touched with just enough emotion that 6 years ago she had married the strongest man in the city. But what she was grateful for wasn't his strength. It was that beside him she had always felt safe. Then she turned toward Liam, her eyes shining. "To you, my love. May you live 100 years in strength and health." Applause thundered through the hall. Someone whistled. Liam accepted the wineglass from his wife, and in the moment he lifted it toward his lips, looking through the dark red curve of the glass. He caught Renata's gaze sliding past his shoulder toward the far end of the room, where Carmine stood leaning against a stone column. Their eyes met for only 1 second, but it was 1 second too long. Longer than the way a wife looked at her husband's friend. A second with weight with heat, with an entire unspoken sentence inside it. Then it vanished so quickly that Liam wondered whether he had imagined it. Renata had already turned back to smile at him. Carmine had raised his glass from across the room in congratulations. Everything became smooth again, like the surface of ice, and Liam drained his wine, scolding himself with the same words he often used to steady younger couples, that a man who saw enemies everywhere would eventually bite at his own shadow. The wine tasted slightly more bitter than usual in the finish that night, with a faint numbness at the tip of his tongue that he blamed on the newly imported grapes, and he didn't think about it again. The party ended at 11 o'clock. One by one, the black cars rolled out through the gates. Renata told him to go upstairs first, that she would give the servants instructions for the cleanup and join him shortly, and Liam went to their bedroom, removed his tie, then entered the bathroom to wash his face. It began in his fingertips. A tingling sensation like needles ran through his left hand as he turned on the faucet, then climbed into his wrist and up his arm, and his heart, that heart which had never missed a beat in 40 years, suddenly stumbled once, then tried to compensate with 3 frantic, uneven blows, like a trapped animal slamming itself against the inside of his chest. Liam gripped the edge of the sink and stared into the mirror, watching his face turn deathly pale and his pupils widen. He tried to draw a deep breath, but his chest felt as though someone had wrapped steel wire around it. His knees weakened and no longer obeyed him, and the final clear thought in his mind was to call for Renata. He opened his mouth, but his tongue had already gone rigid, and the only sound that emerged was a low, broken rasp. Then the cold tile floor rushed upward to meet him. A rinsing glass shattered somewhere very far away, and he lay there with his cheek pressed against the marble, his eyes still open, watching the bathroom light blur into a white halo, hearing footsteps, hearing Renata call his name from the doorway. A call that even in the grip of death he still recognized as too calm, too polished, like a line rehearsed in front of a mirror. What happened afterward reached him only in scattered fragments through a fog that grew thicker with every breath. The servants shouting in confusion outside the hallway. Renata speaking into the telephone and calling Dr. Halloran instead of 911. "Come immediately, he's collapsed." Then the familiar face of the elderly physician who had cared for the family for 15 years bent over him, a flashlight passing across his pupils, 2 fingers pressing against his neck, and Halloran's voice sounded somewhere above, deep and professional, though there was a strange pause before he spoke. "His heart rhythm is collapsing. Acute heart failure. The Falcone family history has always been this way. His father went the same way." After that sentence, no one called an ambulance. Liam wanted to scream that he was still there, that he could hear them, but his body had already become his first coffin, sealed shut even before the wooden one, and the final words that entered his ears, before the fog swallowed everything, were Halloran speaking to Renata in a voice kept deliberately low. "I'll sign the death certificate as natural causes. Sudden heart failure. There's no need for a forensic examination that would only deepen the family's grief." Renata answered with tears in her voice and a calmness so complete it was terrifying. "Thank you, doctor. The Falcone family has a tradition of burial within 4 days. Please help arrange the paperwork in time." Renata had moved with terrifying speed, keeping the news strictly guarded and immediately sealing the private chapel. When Emilio rushed to the estate upon hearing of the tragedy, she barred him from his brother's side, weeping that she couldn't bear to let him suffer for the sight of Liam's cold face, effectively locking him out of any medical examination. He had been left with no choice but to accept Halloran's official signature until the phone rang in the dead of night. 4 days. That was the last number to drift through Liam Falcone's mind before everything closed. Then darkness. Then nothing. Death, as it turned out, wasn't eternal darkness, but darkness filled with sound. Liam Falcone's consciousness returned little by little, not like a man waking from sleep, but like floodwater slowly receding from a house inch by inch. First came hearing, a distant murmur without shape or meaning. Then came smell, a sweetness so heavy it was suffocating, dense and layered, the scent of white lilies, flowers his mother had once told him people bought in such abundance for only one occasion. Last came touch, the most terrifying sense of all, because when feeling returned to his skin, he realized his cheek was losing against a smooth, cold fabric, his back sinking into padding that pressed tightly around his shoulders. And when he tried to open his eyes, tried to lift his hand, tried to move even the smallest joint of one finger, his body answered with the absolute silence of a statue. Only his consciousness remained alive inside it, alert, clear, and imprisoned. The space around him was so narrow that he could feel his own breath rebounding from a wooden surface only a handspan above his nose. Fortunately, since the casket remained within the family's private chapel, the heavy lid had only been placed loosely over the frame, awaiting the final funeral rites, leaving a narrow, invisible gap that allowed just enough fresh air to seep into his dark prison. The breath was still there, shallow, slow, so slow that no one had bothered to check again, and lying flat on his back in white satin, with both hands arranged neatly over his stomach by someone else. Liam Falcone understood where he was even before the first words of the Latin prayer drifted through the wooden lid. 4 days. The thought rose from the final memory he had carried into darkness, Renata's voice speaking of the family custom of burial within 4 days, and he began measuring time with the only thing he still possessed, his ears. He heard the wheels of a cart rolling across marble, the rustling of people adjusting wreaths, the click of a photographer taking pictures for the obituary, and then visitation day came, and his entire world passed one by one above the wooden box. He heard the hard-soled shoes of the capos, each man stopping in turn, and though he couldn't see, he could picture the ritual perfectly. The toughest men on the north side bending to kiss the family ring that had been placed back on his finger. Some murmured prayers in Italian. One voice broke halfway through. Old Sol, who ran the docks, even tapped 2 fingers softly against the coffin lid as though knocking on the door of an old friend. Then Liam heard Emilio. His younger brother said nothing. There was only the breathing of a grown man trying to cry quietly, stretching on, his hand resting on the wood directly above Liam's chest, and for the first time since awakening inside the box, Liam felt something more painful than fear. He wanted to hammer against the lid and shout that he was still there, kid, but his body remained a statue, and his brother's sobs slowly faded until they were carried away by the procession of mourners. The Latin Requiem rose and fell, the crowd thinning with each passing hour, until evening came, and only the scattered notes of the organ remained in the chapel, while the scent of lilies thickened in the stagnant air. Then those 2 sets of footsteps approached him, and those whispers fell through the wooden lid, words he would later know he would carry for the rest of his life, gratitude for a staged heart attack, the soft laughter of a woman leaning against her lover, and the confident assurance that no one would ever know. But they didn't stop there, because they believed the man beneath the wood was already a corpse, and so they kept talking, comfortable as 2 conspirators seated in a locked room, and every sentence that followed became a chisel carving directly into the memory of the man lying beneath them. Carmine's voice was deep, unhurried, filled with the ease of someone who had already calculated every move. Burial on Friday. Make sure you mourn properly. The lawyer reads the will on Monday. You are the widow and the heir. Every document has been in place for a long time. By the end of the month, when the Capapos need someone to lead them, I'll take his chair. It'll happen as naturally as water running downhill. No one objects when a brother steps forward to carry the family through grief and confusion. Renata laughed softly and asked what they would do about the people in the house, because there were several pairs of eyes she didn't like. Carmine answered as lightly as though they were discussing clearing out a storage room. Replace them gradually. Anyone too loyal to him gets dismissed. After a brief silence, Renata spoke the words that made all the blood in Liam's motionless body seem to freeze into stone. Oh, and that pregnant maid, the wide-eyed little bitch who's always watching things. I've been sick of the sight of her for a long time. Once the funeral is over, throw her out so I don't have to look at her anymore. Carmine gave a short laugh through his nose and said, throw her out, or send her after that accountant of hers, depending on the situation. You know what that girl saw. Garbage can't be allowed to speak. The heels moved away. The chapel door closed. Liam was left alone inside the dark box with those 2 sentences echoing over and over, and the mind that had ruled an empire for 8 years began doing what it did best. It assembled the pieces. That accountant of hers, that pregnant maid saw something, and you know it. Tommy Ward, the young man with glasses who had asked for 5 private minutes because he had something important to tell Liam, dead on the highway 2 days later. The discrepancy in the restaurant ledger authorized by a signature from the main office. The handwritten request for leave to attend a fiancé's funeral, written in the slanting script of a maid whose face he had never bothered to remember. The scattered pieces from the previous 4 months arranged themselves inside that narrow darkness, fitting together with horrifying precision, and Liam understood that his heart attack hadn't been the opening act. It had been the second. Before him, someone had already been murdered for daring to look too closely at the numbers, and after him there would be another, a pregnant young woman whose only crime had been dropping a towel outside the boathouse. Rage came to him then, not hot, not roaring, but white and cold like metal left beneath the night sky. It filled the coffin more completely than the scent of lilies, and Liam did what his father had taught him when he was still a shoeshine boy on Taylor Street. He folded that rage, 1 crease at a time, smooth and precise, and placed it inside the deepest drawer in his chest, locking it away for later. Because anger was fire, and fire consumed fuel, And he, the man lying inside his own coffin with a body that still refused to obey him, would need every final drop of that fuel for what was coming. The first thing on that list, the only thing still within the reach of a dead man, was to gather every remaining fragment of his life and focus it upon one tiny point at the end of his right arm, then command it to move, long past midnight, when the final mourner's car had left the gates and the mansion had sunk into the heavy silence of a house in mourning. Luna Hartley still sat upright on the narrow bed in her room, both hands clasped tightly in her lap, listening as the hallway clock marked each passing quarter hour. At last, when the hour hand reached 1 o'clock, she stood, pulled an old sweater over her nightclothes, and crossed the dew-damp rear path barefoot with her shoes in one hand, heading toward the small chapel that stood apart at the eastern corner of the estate, where tomorrow they would carry the master of the house to his grave. She didn't entirely understand what was drawing her there. She only knew that throughout the past 4 days, ever since the morning the mansion had awakened to the mistress's carefully staged sobbing, a stone had been growing inside her chest, and she knew that if she allowed that man to be lowered into the earth without speaking, the stone would crush her for the rest of her life. The chapel's wooden door wasn't locked, only pulled closed, and when Luna slipped inside, the scent of white lilies struck her with such suffocating force that she nearly staggered. Dozens of wreaths lined both sides of the aisle like silent guards, and a few electric candles left glowing on the altar cast a sickly yellow light over the polished walnut coffin resting in the center of the room, its lid closed, gleaming and cold. She stood at the far end of the aisle for a long time, then began walking forward one step at a time, her bare feet making no sound against the stone floor. And when she reached the coffin, she sank to her knees, not according to any church ritual, but in the way people knelt when their legs could no longer carry the weight of everything they had kept hidden. "Sir," she began, and her voice broke on the very first word. "I'm sorry. I don't know who else to tell. I'm too afraid to speak to the living, so I have no choice but to speak to the dead. Please forgive me." She paused, wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, drew a trembling breath, and continued, into the silence of the chapel. "My name is Luna. I'm the maid who works on the second floor. You probably don't know me. 4 months you signed a request allowing me to take 3 days off so I could bury the man I was going to marry. His name was Tommy Ward. He worked as an accountant for your family. He wore glasses and always tied his necktie crooked. You probably don't remember him either. People like us were born so no one would have to remember us." A sound escaped her that was half laughter and half sobbing. Then her shoulders collapsed, and the words she had buried for 4 months began pouring out clumsy, disordered, without beginning or end. "I saw them, sir. That night at the boathouse. I was only taking towels there, I swear. But I saw your wife in Mr. Carmine's arms, and she knew I had seen them. She told me my words were garbage, and that when garbage learned to speak, people burned it. Then 2 days later, my Tommy died. They said it was because of the rain, because the road was slippery, and I stayed silent, sir. I was a coward, and stayed silent because I was afraid, because I still owed $30,000 for my mother's hospital bills, because I had just learned I was carrying a baby and hadn't had the chance to tell him. He died without knowing he was going to be a father, and I keep wondering whether it was my fault, whether he had to die because I dropped that towel that night. And now you're lying here, a healthy man gone in a single night. I don't have any proof. I don't know anything for certain. But something inside me keeps screaming that this isn't right, and I'm about to remain silent again." She lowered her forehead against the edge of the coffin, her shoulders shaking violently, her tears soaking into the polished wood. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm sorry, Tommy. I'm only a maid. I couldn't save anyone, and it was then, within the sickly yellow glow of the candles, at the narrow seam where the coffin lid hadn't yet been screwed to place, the phased right final rights were still to them, that the fingers resting lightly against the wood felt a movement, the movement she would remember for the rest of her life, and Luna's entire body turned to stone. Her first instinct wasn't to run, nor was it to scream. Both hands flew to cover her mouth, pressing so hard that it hurt, because in that instant, faster than fear itself, a truth flashed through her mind like lightning. If she screamed, the entire household would come running, and the first people to arrive would be the same ones who had stood beside this coffin, whispering things she had never been meant to hear. She remained on her knees, her heart pounding wildly, her eyes fixed on the seam beneath the lid, telling herself she was imagining things, that she was exhausted. But then she heard it, a rasping breath as thin as a thread. Trembling, she leaned closer and gently shifted the unsecured lid aside, just enough to create a narrow opening. The dead man's eyes were open. They weren't vacant or lifeless. They were staring directly at her, terrifying awareness, and within them was nothing but a silent plea she understood as clearly as written words. Don't call anyone. Please, don't call anyone in this house. Luna sank onto the stone floor, one hand still covering her mouth and the other wrapped protectively around her stomach, and within the space of 3 breaths, her entire life arrived at a crossroads. Calling the mistress meant death. He would die, and perhaps Luna would die as well. Calling the police meant gambling her life on people who would believe Dr. Halloran's word before the word of a maid. Then she remembered a name, one she had carried in her wallet for 3 years on a business card, worn soft at the corners, the young emergency room physician at the county hospital who had wrestled her mother back from death and given her 6 more months. The only person in that city who had ever treated Luna and her mother like human beings. The man who had pressed the card into her hand and told her to call him directly if she ever needed anything. It wasn't until much later, when Luna had stood crying in the rain outside Tommy's funeral home, that Marta told her the kind doctor's last name was Falcone, that he was the younger brother the crime lord had pushed away from the world of darkness so he could live a clean life. Emilio Falcone, the younger brother of the man lying inside the box before her. Family, but not part of the household. Luna looked into those pleading eyes, and instead of asking why, instead of demanding to understand, she leaned close to the opening and whispered in a voice still wet with tears but no longer trembling. Listen to me, sir. I'm going to call Dr. Emilio, and only him. I swear on my child. But you have to help me with one thing. Dawn is coming soon. They'll come to screw down the lid and carry you to the grave. From now until then, no matter what happens, you must remain exactly as you were. You must die one more time. You must be very good at being dead, because that's the only way either of us will still have a chance to live. Emilio Falcone arrived through the chapel's rear door, shortly before 3 o'clock in the morning, exactly 40 minutes after the call, that he would later say he had answered half asleep and utterly convinced that someone was playing a cruel joke on him. An unfamiliar number, a trembling young woman's voice identifying herself as a maid in the Falcone household. I brought my mother into your emergency room 3 years ago. Do you remember me, doctor? Please come to the mansion chapel right now. Use the back entrance. Don't tell anyone. I swear on the life of my unborn child that I'm not insane. Your brother is still breathing. He had driven across the city in the clothes he slept in, his emergency bag thrown onto the passenger seat, his mind repeating over and over that it was a trap, while his foot kept pressing harder on the accelerator. Because there were some calls a person simply wasn't allowed to ignore. When Luna opened the wooden door just wide enough for him to slip inside, when he walked between the 2 rows of funeral wreaths and saw the coffin lid pushed aside, saw the chest of the brother he had spent 4 days mourning, rising, falling with breaths as delicate as dragonfly wings, Emilio Falcone, who had witnessed every boundary between life and death during 10 years of medicine, had to grip the side of the coffin to remain standing. But he allowed himself exactly 3 seconds. Luna counted them. 3 seconds of disbelief, and then the physician inside him forced the younger brother down. He opened his bag, placed the stethoscope in his ears, lifted Liam's eyelids and shone a light into them, checked the pulse at his wrist and then at his neck, measured his blood pressure, and drew 2 small vials of blood, every movement precise and economical, not a single gesture wasted, while his eyes were finally full with tears. When Liam gathered every scrap of strength I had and forced his lips to form a weak, distorted whisper. You look terrible. Emilio let out a sound that was half laughter and half a strangled sob. He bent down and pressed his forehead against his brother's for one brief moment, then answered in a voice that still wasn't steady. You've been lying in a coffin for 4 days, and you're still criticizing me. That was the entire reunion the 2 brothers allowed themselves, because dawn was already beginning to gather outside. When Emilio finished examining him, he sank onto the step below the altar, clasped both hands behind his neck, and spoke in the flat, measured voice Luna understood was how he contained his fury. This wasn't heart failure. I don't even need the laboratory results before I'd sign my name to that diagnosis. You were poisoned with a compound that causes muscular paralysis and cardiac arrhythmia. The dose was calculated to kill you. Your heartbeat became so slow and shallow that careless equipment, or a doctor who was deliberately careless, would declare you dead. There was no miracle here, only someone who miscalculated the poison by exactly 0.5 milligram in the stubborn constitution of a Falcone. He looked up at his brother. Now listen to me. Your body will recover, but it'll take weeks. You can't walk, you can't stand, and you can barely speak. If we announce that you're alive now, you'll be a bedridden witness surrounded by the people who already killed you once and know perfectly well that they need to finish the job. So our only option is the most impossible one. Tomorrow morning, the funeral has to proceed exactly as planned. Liam gathered all the strength he could and slowly closed his eyes once in place of a nod. The remaining problem was that the coffin couldn't be lowered into the grave with a living man inside, but it also couldn't be empty on the shoulders of 8 pallbearers. Emilio was the one who thought of the only man capable of solving that problem, old Mr. Moreau, director of the funeral home on North Avenue. The man who personally prepared their father's body 15 years earlier, and the man few people still remembered had once been saved by the Falcone family. 40 years ago, when his business was about to be seized by a group of loan sharks, Liam and Emilio's grandfather had intervened and settled the matter without accepting a single cent in return. He had said only one thing: "Your profession is to send people away with dignity. This city needs that more than it needs money." Mr. Moreau answered Emilio's call at 4 o'clock in the morning and remained silent for a very long time before asking a single question. "You swear to me this isn't an attempt to conceal a crime?" Emilio replied. "It's the opposite. This is the only way to bring a crime into the light." The old man said, "Then the Falcone family owes me nothing more. This morning I'll screw down the lid myself." What followed became a ritual hidden inside another ritual. Before the funeral procession began, Mr. Moreau tactfully sent every employee out of the chapel, claiming he needed to perform one final inspection according to the family's wishes. During the 20 minutes the doors remained closed, the 3 of them moved Liam Falcone onto a folding stretcher, concealed inside a secondary hearse, then placed counterweight sandbags wrapped in cloth inside the coffin, prepared by the old man from the training props in his storage room. They adjusted the weight until it matched that of a man weighing nearly 200 pounds, then sealed the polished walnut lid for good. The burial took place at 10 o'clock beneath a gray sky, and while the entire family stood around the open grave, Moreau's secondary hearse quietly circled through the service gate at the rear of the property. Luna was waiting there to guide it along a gravel road hidden behind the oak trees, toward the old vine-covered greenhouse at the farthest edge of the western grounds, where the elderly gardener had retired 2 years earlier and no one had ever replaced him. Inside was a small room that smelled of soil and dry leaves, a room Luna and Marta had secretly cleaned since midnight and furnished with a single bed. When Emilio asked whether the place was safe, Luna answered with a certainty that surprised even her. "This mistress has never set foot here, doctor. I've worked in this house for 2 years, and I know." To her, the servants' quarters aren't even worthy of her contempt, much less her presence. The folding wheelchair Mr. Moreau had left with the stretcher was opened by Emilio inside the small greenhouse room that smelled of earth. And it was Liam himself, speaking through slow blinks in place of words, who insisted on being placed in it, insisted on being pushed close to the window that looked toward the gentle slope at the eastern edge of the estate, where the Falcone family cemetery rested beneath the shade of oak trees more than 100 years old, where his grandfather lay, where his father lay, and where, at 10 o'clock that morning, through glass clouded with condensation and the narrow gaps between the climbing leaves, the head of the family sat motionless in a wheelchair and watched 8 men in black suits carry his own walnut coffin through its final steps toward the open grave. The distance was great enough that no one could see him, but close enough for him to see everything, and everything was a performance staged so perfectly that, had it not been the man who had spent the past 4 days inside that box, perhaps even he would have wept. He saw hundreds of dark figures standing in an arc around the grave, his capos, men who had once sworn their loyalty in blood, all bowing their heads in obedience. He saw the priestess sprinkle holy water. He saw Emilio standing in the front row, his face arranged into grief so convincing that Liam silently thought his doctor brother had apparently possessed a talent for acting all along, because only the night before, Emilio had pressed his forehead against Liam's and trembled. Then he saw his wife. Renata stepped forward from the mourners in an elegant black outfit tailored without a single flaw, a thin veil drawn low enough to conceal her dry eyes, while remaining transparent enough for the reporters behind the velvet rope to capture the sorrowful lines of a young widow's face. She approached the edge of the grave holding a single white rose, stood motionless for exactly 3 breaths, as though she had rehearsed it, then released the flower into the grave with a slow, graceful movement that looked almost choreographed. The moment the rose touched the coffin lid, her shoulders collapsed at precisely the right time, and her legs faltered with precisely the right measure, allowing 100 pairs of eyes and dozens of cameras to witness the tall man beside her reach out and catch her. Renata Falcone fell against Carmine Russo's shoulder and began to sob, each broken breath carrying just far enough, while his hand rested on her back and patted her with the proper restraint of a loyal brother stepping in to protect the dead man's widow, an image Liam knew would appear the following morning on the front page of the City section, beneath some moving caption about the bonds of loyalty within the Falcone family. Inside the greenhouse, there was no sound except the shallow breathing of the man in the wheelchair, but Luna, standing close behind his shoulder, saw the master's right hand. The hand that 3 nights earlier had been unable to lift even the joint of a single finger, slowly tighten around the edge of the thin blanket covering his knees. It tightened until the knuckles rose white beneath skin still gray from poison, tightened as though the entire storm forbidden from escaping in sound had been forced into that one fistful of cloth, while his face remained still, the only signs of emotion a jaw clenched into a straight line, and unblinking eyes fixed on the 2 people embracing beside his own grave. Luna didn't think. Even later, she couldn't explain it. Her hand simply reached forward and rested upon the shoulder of the man no one in the entire city would have dared touch without permission. A light, awkward touch through the fabric of his shirt, not meant to soothe, not meant as a promise, only to say that he wasn't standing there alone while he watched this. She felt his entire body stiffen for an instant, the reflex of an alpha animal at any unfamiliar contact. But then, slowly, muscle by muscle, the shoulder beneath her hand relaxed, and he didn't pull away. They remained that way until the first shovelfuls of earth fell into the grave, reaching them as a distant muffled sound until the mourners gradually dispersed and the black cars left the estate, one after another. Then Luna rolled the wheelchair back from the glass, drew the old cloth curtain closed, and the longest day of both their lives slowly faded into an evening that was strangely quiet. On the first night in the greenhouse, Emilio finished the second bag of intravenous fluid and had to return to the hospital in time for his shift so no one would become suspicious. He gave Luna careful instructions for every dose of medicine and every hour it had to be given, and the small room was left with only 2 strangers and a secret powerful enough to kill them both. Luna set a wooden chair 3 steps from the bed and sat beneath the dim light of an oil lamp turned low, because they didn't dare switch on the electricity. She repaired the loose seam in her apron simply to keep her hands occupied, while Liam lay on his side, staring at the abandoned plant pots arranged along the glass wall. Neither spoke for an entire hour, because they had no common language yet except survival, until his voice rose from the darkness, rough and slow, each word shaped like a man learning to walk upon his own tongue. "What is your name?" Luna looked up from her needlework. "Luna, sir. Luna Hartley." A long silence followed. Then the man who had just attended his own funeral spoke again, his eyes still fixed upon the empty pots. "Luna, tomorrow, if you still have enough courage to remain in this room, I need you to tell me about Tommy Ward, from the beginning, without leaving out a single thing. But tonight, go to sleep. You're carrying a child, and beneath this roof, from this day forward, that is the most important thing." The next 3 weeks passed inside the greenhouse like a season of their own, separate from the rest of the world, and within that small world filled with the scent of damp earth and dry leaves, the man who had once controlled an entire corner of Chicago with a single nod had to relearn from the beginning the things even a 2-year-old child already knew. During the first week, Luna fed him soup 1 spoonful at a time, and she would always remember that first morning, when she lifted the spoon to his lips and saw in the master's eyes something she had never seen in anyone inside that mansion. The naked humiliation of a lion forced to let another person feed him. His jaw clenched, his neck went rigid, and he swallowed each spoonful as though swallowing stones, his eyes fixed on the glass ceiling where vines wove together like a net, avoiding her gaze, until Luna, not knowing where she found the courage, spoke softly as she filled the next spoon. "When my mother was sick, the thing she hated most was letting me feed her. She said it was humiliating, so I told her, 'Mama, when I was a helpless baby, you fed me for 3 years and never complained. Now let me repay the debt.' People caring for one another when they're weak is the most ordinary thing in the world. There's nothing shameful about it." She watched the man's jaw slowly loosen. He swallowed the next spoonful more gently, and though he said nothing, from that day forward, he stopped staring at the ceiling. During the second week, feeling returned to his fingertips, and the training sessions began, sessions Liam would later call the longest battle of his life, fought against no enemy except a small metal spoon. Luna placed it in his palm, curled each finger around the handle, held his wrist between both of her hands, and together they guided the spoon from the bowl to his mouth. The first attempt spilled, the second spilled, the 13th spilled. Soup stained the cloth, his shirt, and one afternoon, with the first spark of returning strength, he managed to fling Chew the spoon into a flower pot, then sat breathing heavily as he stared at it lying on the floor. Luna said nothing. She simply picked it up, wiped it clean, placed it back in his hand, and curled his fingers around it again, as though his anger had never happened, until one evening near the end of the second week, when the trembling spoon completed the entire journey from the bowl to his lips without spilling a single drop. After swallowing the first spoonful he had fed himself in his second life, the man remained silent for a long time, then said in a voice that had grown less hoarse, "My father used to say power meant never having to do anything with your own hands. He was wrong, Luna. This is power. Being able to lift a spoonful of soup to your own mouth." It was during those weeks, between the exercises and the meals, that two strangers began to see each other, not through long conversations or confessions, but through small fragments of their lives that fell naturally between them like leaves. He learned that she had risen at 4:30 every morning for the past 2 years, learned about the $30,000 in hospital debt, learned about the silver ring hanging from the chain beneath her collar. She learned that the most feared crime lord in the city would be terrified of the scent of lilies for the rest of his life. Learned that he was left-handed, but that his father had forced him to train his right hand from childhood. Learned that he remembered exactly the final meal his mother had cooked before she died. One rainy afternoon, while water tapped steadily into the glass roof when Liam was changing the bandage over the needle mark on the back of his hand, Liam suddenly asked the question that had been waiting inside him since their first night there. "Why did you save me? You knew exactly who I was. I'm the kind of man your world has every reason to leave for dead." Luna's hand stopped, but she didn't look up. She remained silent for so long that he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she spoke slowly and clearly, each word sounding as though it had been shaped and sharpened long ago. "I didn't save a crime lord, sir. I saved a man who had been betrayed, because I know what it feels like to be betrayed and have no one believe you. That night in the chapel, when you opened your eyes and looked at me, I didn't see the most powerful man on the north side. I only saw someone being buried alive by the very people who shared his bed and his table. That's something I understand. I understand it better than anyone." The room held only the sound of rain. Liam looked at the young woman bending her head as she wrapped the final layer of gauze around his hand, looked at the hands cracked from years of cleaning floors, now caring for the hand that had signed orders capable of making men tremble. And for the first time in his life, the heir to the Falcone family made a promise to someone who served him. It wasn't an order. It wasn't charity. It was a promise spoken in a voice low and solid as stone being set into the ground. "Luna, listen to me. Tommy Ward didn't die because it was raining, and he didn't die because the road was slippery. He died because he did his duty honestly, and this world buried him beneath the word accident. I won't promise you revenge. Revenge doesn't bring anyone back. But I promise you this. I will give him back his name, so your child can grow up knowing its father was an honest man, not a few lines in a morning news report." Luna sat perfectly still. Then she rose without saying a word. crossed to the corner where an old cloth bag held the few belongings she had brought from her room, searched beneath everything inside, and returned carrying a small brown leather notebook, no larger than her hand, its corners worn and a stretched rubber band wrapped around it. She placed it in Liam's palm, her voice tightening with emotion. "This is the only thing of his I managed to keep." The police returned the personal belongings from the car. I took this notebook because it was the thing he valued most. He carried it everywhere. Every night he would write in it and smile to himself. I've held it against me while I slept for 4 months, but I've never dared open it because I was afraid of seeing his handwriting. You take it. You said you wanted to know everything about my Tommy from the beginning, without leaving out a single thing. Then perhaps this is where you should begin. The 5th person to learn the secret of the greenhouse arrived on an evening at the end of the 3rd week, when Liam could stand on his own for maybe 10 minutes at a time and walk from the bed to the wooden table with the slow steps of a man learning the world again. Liam himself asked for the man to be summoned, and he specified exactly how the message was to be delivered, not by telephone, not by text, but on a scrap of paper that Marta, who had spent the past 3 weeks quietly bringing food and keeping every secret exactly as she had promised Luna, would personally slip into the stack of tax documents the law office regularly received from the mansion. The paper contained only a single unsigned handwritten line. 9 o'clock Wednesday evening. The greenhouse at the far end of the garden. Use the service gate. Bring a pen. Liam told Luna that to anyone else, those words would mean nothing, but Aldo Ferrante would recognize the handwriting among 1,000 others, because he was the man who had held Liam's hand and taught him to sign his first legal documents when Liam was 22 years old. At exactly 9 o'clock on Wednesday evening, 3 dry, precise knocks sounded against the greenhouse doorframe, and when Luna opened the door slightly, a 64-year-old man in a gray overcoat stepped inside. He stood as straight as a ruler, his silver hair combed back without a single strand out of place, an old leather briefcase in his hand. He stopped in the dim room and stared at the man, bracing one hand against the edge of the table as he rose from a wooden chair. And in that moment, the attorney who had gone 40 years without revealing emotion in any courtroom or negotiation suddenly lifted one hand to his mouth and held it there for 3 breaths. Then he did something neither Luna nor Liam had time to prevent. He stepped forward, lowered one knee onto the greenhouse floor, took Liam's right hand, where the family ring Emilio had removed from the hand of the dead man that night, now rested once again in its rightful place, and pressed a kiss to it according to an ancient custom that only men of his generation still observed. Then he looked up, his eyes red behind his reading glasses, though his voice remained as flat as a sheet of paper. "I buried your father, Liam. 3 weeks ago, I stood beside your grave and believed I was being forced to bury the 3rd generation as well. I don't intend to bury you again. Now tell me who did this to you." Liam told him everything in the exact order his mind had arranged it during the 3 weeks he had spent staring at the glass ceiling. The glass of wine at the party, the paralysis spreading from his fingertips, Dr. Halloran's hurried signature on the death certificate, 4 days inside the wooden box, the whispers beside the coffin lid, which he repeated in the steady, emotionless voice of a man reading testimony into the record. Aldo listened with a leather notebook open across his knees, his old fountain pen moving without pause. He didn't interrupt once, stopping only from time to time to confirm a detail about the timing before continuing to write. When Liam finished, the old man closed the notebook, removed his glasses, cleaned them with a handkerchief, put them back on, and said, "Good. Emotion comes later. Now we work. A case like this is like building a house, young master. No one builds from the roof downward. We lay each brick from the foundation upward, and every brick must be solid. The first brick must answer the simplest question of all. Were you truly poisoned?" That brick was placed on the greenhouse table exactly 1 week later, when Emilio arrived carrying a sealed envelope containing the results from an independent laboratory in another state, where he had sent the blood samples taken on the first night, along with a hair sample collected afterward, all under an anonymous patient number. Aldo read the report twice from beginning to end before placing it neatly in the center of the table and tapping one finger against the conclusion. Here, a compound that causes muscular paralysis and cardiac arrhythmia. The concentration found near the roots of the hair shows a single exposure, matching the night of the anniversary party. It wasn't any medication you had ever been prescribed. It wasn't something a person could swallow by accident. Someone calculated a dose for a man weighing nearly 200 pounds. The first brick, young master. Someone deliberately poisoned you. It's right here. The second brick took another 10 days. 10 days during which Aldo entered and left his own law office like a spy working behind enemy lines, quietly removing archived copies of documents he had full authority to access as the family attorney without needing anyone's permission. That evening, he spread 2 sets of papers across the greenhouse table. His voice still flat, though the fingers resting upon the documents trembled slightly. Look here, young master. Your will and your emergency power of attorney. Updated copies of both were filed 3 months before the party. They transferred almost complete authority over your assets and temporary control of the organization to your wife. At the same time, your life insurance policy was amended. The sole beneficiary is Renata Falcone. The value is $12 million. Now look at this signature. Liam leaned forward and studied his own name written neatly at the bottom of the page. The shape was correct. The angle was correct. But he needed only 3 seconds before shaking his head. I didn't sign these. The curve on the letter F is too round. I haven't written it that way since I broke my index finger when I was 30. Aldo nodded slowly, as though he had been waiting for precisely those words. I know. I've kept 20 years of your signatures. This is a highly sophisticated forgery, made by someone who had access to many genuine examples of your handwriting. The second brick, young master. That person didn't merely want you dead. They prepared the documents necessary to profit from your death 3 months in advance. When someone cares for 3 months, it's no longer jealousy or a sudden impulse. The law calls it premeditated murder. As for me, the old man removed his glasses, and for the first time that evening, his voice fell noticeably softer. I call it something I can't forgive, because 3 months ago, that same girl sat at my dinner table, asked about my wife's arthritis, and smiled. Tommy Ward's brown leather notebook lay on the wooden table in the greenhouse for several days before Liam opened it, not because he had forgotten, but because he understood what he was holding. It was the last possession of a man that a young woman had slept clutching against her chest for 4 months, and he wanted to wait until Aldo had laid the first 2 bricks in place, until his hand was steady enough to turn each thin page without trembling. But that night, after the elderly attorney left, carrying the 2 sets of forged documents, Liam drew the oil lamp closer, slipped off the stretched rubber band, and opened the notebook beneath the yellow light. The first page tightened his chest in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't the numbers, it was the handwriting, small, perfectly even, painfully careful, the handwriting of a poor boy raised to believe that beautiful penmanship was the only respectable face a man could present when he had nothing else to his name. Inside the leather cover, in faded ink, was a single line. If found, please return to Thomas Ward. Beneath it was a telephone number, followed by the words, thank you. Liam turned the page, and from the 3rd page onward, the private world of the young accountant opened before him. 1/2 was life, hurried notes about rent, savings for a ring, the anniversary of meeting Elle, the noodles Elle liked, the dream of taking Elle away from the city. The other half, growing better with every page, was work, thousands of figures copied by hand, dates, transaction codes, company names, and red question marks multiplying along the margins, like flowers warning of a coming storm. Liam read through the night, and the following morning, when Aldo returned in response to an urgent message, the 2 men spread the pages side by side and compared them with copies of the company ledgers the old attorney had managed to obtain. For 3 straight days, the greenhouse became a secret auditing room, where the turning of paper replaced conversation, until on the evening of the 3rd day, the complete picture emerged across the wooden table, cold and unmistakably clear, leaving no room for a single excuse. 18 months. Tommy Ward had begun following the trail 18 months earlier. 3 supply companies with impressive names but no warehouses, no employees, nothing except mailing addresses and bank accounts, had regularly issued invoices for services no one had ever seen. Each invoice was worth only tens of thousands of dollars, small enough to pass unnoticed beneath every gaze. And by the time Aldo finished adding the final column and laid down his pen, more than $2 million had flowed out of Falcone business through those 3 invisible channels. Every payment order was legitimate on paper, because everyone carried an authorized signature, the signature of Carmine Russo. the trusted brother who held full authority over the family's legitimate business operations. And that wasn't all. Tommy had followed the money farther. The final pages of the notebook recorded where it went next. From the 3 shell companies, a significant portion had been transferred under the description of brand consulting fees to a small cosmetics company registered in the suburbs, a company Liam had never heard of, but one Aldo needed only a single morning to verify, confirming what the notebook had already suspected with its largest red question mark. The registered owner was Renata Falcone. The final page containing any writing held only 4 brief lines, and Liam read those 4 lines again and again. Enough preliminary evidence. Can't report through immediate superior. Must meet Mr. F directly. Request meeting Thursday. Beneath them was a date, and Liam didn't need to consult a calendar to know it was 2 days before the wet morning on the highway. He sat motionless for a long time, then spoke, not loudly, not through clenched teeth, only evenly and coldly like stone at the bottom of the lake. They sat at my table for 18 months, Aldo. 18 months passing me wine, clapping me on the shoulder, asking after my health, while the money flowed out, saving their final stroke of forgery for the documents they slipped in 3 months ago. They made their decision a long time ago. The night of the party was only the day the debt came due. It was then that both men realized Luna was standing in the doorway with a tea tray in her hands, and from her face, they understood that she had been there long enough to hear everything she needed to hear. She set the tray on the edge of the table with hands that had suddenly become clumsy. Her eyes fixed on the notebook pages covering the wood, on the tiny, perfectly even handwriting she recognized from 3 steps away, and her voice broke apart as she spoke. So that was it. That was what he wrote down every night before telling me not to worry, that he was almost finished, that we were almost ready to leave this place. So it wasn't the rain, it wasn't the slippery road. He died because of this notebook, and I held it while I slept for 4 months. I held the very thing that killed him without knowing. If I had opened it sooner, if I had given it to someone sooner. The sentence collapsed there. Her shoulders folded inward, but she didn't fall, because a hand settled upon her shoulder, Liam's hand, the hand of a man who had risen from his chair and crossed 3 steps without holding on to anything. He didn't embrace her. He didn't offer a long speech of comfort. He simply kept that hand on her first shoulder, firm and warm, holding her upright, and spoke with the weight of words being carved into stone. You didn't kill Tommy, Luna. The people who killed him have names, and they're sitting inside my house. This notebook isn't what killed him. It's what he left behind to protect you and your child, and from tonight forward, that is exactly what it will do. I promised to give Tommy Ward his name back, and here it is. He wrote everything down with his own hand. All we have to do now is read it aloud so the whole world can hear. The 18-month mark kept returning to Aldebarante Frana's mind like a pebble trapped inside a shoe. And he told Liam as much on the evening he arrived at the Granny house carrying a brief ground case more swollen than usual, because 40 years of legal practice had taught him that criminals who planned carefully didn't choose their starting dates at random. When dirty money began to flow from a particular point in time, there was usually a particular event standing at the source. So for the past week, he had worked backward through that period in every file he was authorized to touch. Insurance correspondence, meeting minutes, old financial records, until, inside a storage box containing unsubmitted drafts, the family's insurance brokerage routinely transferred to archives at the end of each year, he found a thin set of papers that should never have existed, and he placed it on the wooden table before Liam with both hands, the way someone might set down a knife. It was a draft claim for a life insurance payout prepared in advance down to the smallest detail. The insured person was Liam Falcone. The event was described as a boating accident on Lake Michigan. The anticipated cause of death was listed as engine failure, leading to a capsized boat far from shore. The date of preparation was printed clearly in the corner, and Liam stared at it for a long time because he remembered that date. Who could have forgotten that weekend 18 months earlier, the annual early summer fishing trip shared by only 2 men, the clear weather, the calm lake, Karmzine's motorboat traveling farther from shore than in previous years because he had said the fish had moved into deeper water. Then the engine coughing and dying completely in the middle of the endless lake. Then the afternoon storm arriving faster than the forecast. The waves on Lake Michigan rising like ocean swells, the boat tilting, and Liam, never a strong swimmer, remaining beneath that cold gray water, long enough to watch the light above him shrink into a coin before a hand seized the back of his collar and dragged him upward. Carmine's hand, the same man who afterward had held him on the pitching deck while cursing the heavens, the man who sat drinking with him late into that night and spoke the words Liam had remembered with gratitude again and again throughout the past 18 months. What would I have left if I lost you, brother? The draft before him had been prepared 3 days before that fishing trip. 3 days before the engine failed, someone had already sat down and typed every line describing his death on the water, and on the final page, where a signature should have been, there was only a handwritten note in blue ink, written in the elegant slang script Liam had seen for 66 years on birthday cards and messages left on the dining table. Postpone. Can't use yet. 3 words, nothing more. And Aldo spoke softly into thick slice of the greenhouse. I checked everything. At that time, your old will was still in effect. Most of your assets were tied to the family trust and hadn't yet been transferred under your wife's control. Their documents weren't finished, young master. If you had died that day, they wouldn't have received very much. So, the old man paused, removed his glasses, and for the first time Liam heard his voice tremble, so that was why he jumped into the water and pulled you out. It wasn't brotherhood. He was protecting his investment. No one in the greenhouse spoke after that. Aldo quietly gathered the documents and left when the hour had grown late. Emilio sent word that he wouldn't be able to come until the following day. After Luna cleared away the dishes from a dinner no one had finished, she returned to find that Liam was no longer seated at the table. He sat on the edge of the bed with his back bowed in a way she had never seen from this man, not even during the days when he hadn't been able to lift a spoon, and in both hands he held an old yellowed photograph taken from the wallet Emilio had recovered with the rest of his personal belongings. It was a black and white picture of 2 thin boys sitting on the stone steps of Taylor Street, with a shoe-shine box at their feet. The younger boy grinned broadly with one arm around the older one's shoulders, and both of them held up fingers stained with shoe polish toward the camera of some kind-hearted stranger. Luna didn't need to ask who my smiling younger boy was. She said nothing. She didn't ask whether Hua was all that, didn't pour him water, didn't search for words of comfort on a night when every word of comfort would have felt like an insult. She simply walked over, sat beside him on the edge of the bed, one handspan away, placed both hands in her lap, and remained there, breathing in rhythm with the room, allowing the oil lamp to burn, and the man beside her to stare at the photograph for as long as he needed. A long time passed before Liam finally spoke, his eyes never leaving the picture, his voice dry and low, as though he were speaking directly to the boy inside it. That winter, he gave me our only pair of gloves because my hands were cracked and bleeding. I thought that if there was only one person in the world I could trust, it would be him. He said nothing more and didn't cry. There was only the hard line of his clenched jaw and the strange care with which he returned the photograph to his wallet, as though something inside that image hadn't completely died yet, and he still couldn't bear to bury it. Then he lifted his eyes toward the dark shapes of the flower pots beyond the glass, and Luna, sitting silently beside him, suddenly understood that she had witnessed something even more painful than the night he overheard the plan to murder him, because that night he had lost a wife, but tonight he had lost his entire childhood. Marta came to the greenhouse early one evening, at the beginning of the week, with the usual basket of supplies, but this time she didn't linger to ask after the young master's health, as she always did. She set the basket on the table, straightened her back, and delivered the news in the brisk voice of a woman who had spent 40 years learning how to say important things in the shortest possible time. There's a purge happening inside the house, young master. This week, the mistress dismissed 6 people, all of them longtime staff. Old Pete at the gate, who had been there since your father's time, the head cook, 2 gardeners, the assistant driver. Every one of them received an envelope and a thank you sweet as sugar, along with the explanation that the household was reducing staff after the funeral. But these old eyes see something else. Every person dismissed was loyal to you, every one of them someone who could watch and listen on your behalf, and every new face brought in has been recommended by Mr. Russo's office. And there's something more. She lowered her voice and looked directly at Liam. This morning, the personnel manager summoned Luna and told her Mr. Russo wanted to meet with her privately in the main house on Thursday afternoon, supposedly to discuss arrangements for a servant in special circumstances. I used the cleaning schedule as an excuse to postpone it until next week, but I can only delay it once. The greenhouse fell silent. Luna stood beside the oil stove with her hands frozen in the middle of their work, while Liam said nothing for 3 breaths. But after so many weeks beside him, Luna could read the storm in the way his fingers became perfectly still upon the tabletop. Both of them heard again the whispers beside the coffin lid. Throw her into the street, or send her after that accountant of hers. The machine had begun moving, exactly on schedule and in the proper order, first clearing away the watching eyes, then dealing with the witness, and that private meeting on Thursday afternoon, whether it ended with a dismissal envelope or something worse, was a move Liam couldn't allow to happen. He remained awake through the entire night beside the wooden table, and by morning the plan he presented made both Emilio and Aldo fall silent for a moment over the encrypted telephone before agreeing, because it was simple to the point of cruelty. To protect Luna from Renata's hands, they had to make Renata believe she had already won. A hunted animal was no longer pursued once the hunter believed it had been thrown out of the forest. Luna would be dismissed, publicly, shamefully, and immediately. Marta arranged the performance. She deliberately slipped one of the mistress's old brooches into Luna's sewing basket, then discovered it herself in front of the personnel manager, creating a swift accusation that required no serious investigation, because who would ever bother examining the case of a maid? By noon on Wednesday, one day before Carmen's planned meeting, the entire mansion was buzzing with the news that the pregnant servant had been thrown out for stealing. Renata merely frowned when she heard the report, then flicked one hand as though brushing away dust. She even appeared satisfied that someone else had spared her the trouble, exactly as Liam had predicted. To a woman like her, a maid cast into the street in disgrace was a maid erased from existence. From that moment forward, anything she said would be dismissed as the word of a thief, no longer worth considering. Carmine, when informed that the woman he had intended to meet on Thursday had already been dismissed the previous day, simply shrugged and let it pass. Someone else had taken out the garbage. No one in the main house knew that the old taxi which collected the maid and her cloth bag from the service gate that afternoon didn't drive toward the poor boarding district on the south side. It circled 3 blocks, where Luna transferred into another car driven by one of Mr. Moreau's men, and eventually stopped in the alley behind the restaurant on Taylor Street, where a wooden staircase led to a small second-floor apartment, normally reserved for the manager. It had been prepared 2 days earlier with fresh bedding, a full refrigerator, and a telephone containing only 4 numbers. But before any of that, before the taxi and the staged discovery of the brooch, there had been one final evening in the greenhouse, an evening both of them knew would be the last, though neither spoke the truth aloud. Luna packed her cloth bag more slowly than necessary, folding and refolding her old sweater, while Liam sat at the table pretending to reread pages he already knew by heart, until she finally rose and walked toward him to place the room key on the table. At that exact moment, she suddenly stopped in the middle of a step, one hand gripping the back of the chair and the other pressing against her stomach. Liam was on his feet so quickly that his chair fell backward. "What is it? Should I call Emilio?" But Luna shook her head, and when she looked up, a wet smile had appeared across her still startled face. "No," she whispered, "the baby kicked. It's the first time, sir. It kicked." Then, with a natural lack of calculation that she would never later understand, she took the hand of the most powerful man on the north side and placed it against one side of her stomach. "Right here." Liam Falcone stood there with the hand that had once signed orders of life and death resting upon the faded fabric of her dress, motionless and holding his breath, until beneath his palm came a tiny, stubborn, unmistakably living push, an unborn child knocking from the other side, and the man forgot how to breathe. Something inside his chest seemed to break and mend at the same time, because for the first time since the night he had lain inside the coffin, fear returned to him, but it was a completely different fear. It wasn't fear for himself. It was fear for the life no larger than a fist that had just kicked beneath his hand, fear for the mother smiling with tears in her eyes, fear that the world beyond the glass still wanted to harm them. When he finally withdrew his hand, he spoke so quietly that the words seemed meant for himself. "You leave tomorrow." No one there will be able to touch either of you. I promise. Luna nodded and adjusted the strap of her cloth bag, and for 1 second, they both looked in opposite directions, because they had each just realized they were about to lose something that neither of them had dared name or explain them. After Luna had been safely settled in the apartment on Taylor Street, the greenhouse became uncomfortably spacious and silent, and Liam poured all that emptiness into his work that now had a name, the flow of money, because Aldo, with the instincts of an old fox who had spent his life among documents, had pointed out a new irregularity. More than $2 million had been siphoned through 3 shell companies over 18 months, yet the portion flowing into Renata's cosmetics company accounted for less than 1/3 of it. So where had the rest gone? The larger share controlled by Carmine. Money belonging to men like him never remained still. Men like him always used money to purchase something, and the old attorney wanted to know what Carmine was buying. The man assigned to answer that question was someone Liam selected only after careful consideration. Rocco, the elderly driver and bodyguard who had served his father since the days when the two families still fought over every row of city blocks. One of the 6 longtime employees Renata had recently dismissed during her purge. A man whose loyalty had survived 3 decades of testing, and who could now, under the appearance of a bitter, unemployed servant, move through the old taverns of the underworld without causing the slightest ripple. Marta delivered the message. Mr. Moreau provided a car no one would recognize, and after standing silently for 3 minutes inside the greenhouse, staring at the young master he had believed dead, Rocco spoke only 1 sentence. Which direction does the boss need this old man to swim? The answer was the south side. The first scraps of information Rocco gathered after 2 weeks of drifting through old drinking places already carried a strange scent. Low-ranking men from the Corvino family, the clan across the border, the ancestral enemy whose truce with the Falconans 8 years earlier had only frozen the conflict and never truly resolved it, had recently begun drinking with unusual generosity. Under the influence, they spoke about a great season of business soon to arrive, about northern docks changing flags, about shipping routes opening, as though someone had promised them a share of territory that had always belonged to the Falcones. Then, at the beginning of the 3rd week, Rocco followed the car of a familiar intermediary and witnessed something he later reported over the encrypted telephone in the strangled voice of a man who had just seen an unforgivable violation of honor. Young master, last night, at the cold storage warehouse behind the South Side Fish Market, I saw Mr. Russo enter through the rear door. He was alone, without guards, and the man who came out to receive him was old Corvino's eldest grandson, the one now running the family. From that night forward, the operation entered what Aldo, with his lawyer's vocabulary, called the collection of visual and audio evidence. Mr. Moreau contributed an unexpected tool from his professional storage, recording devices no larger than buttons, normally installed inside funeral parlors so distant relatives could listen to eulogies. Rocco handled access, winning over the fish market warehouse manager, a man who owed the Falcone family an old debt. During the next 3 meetings, held roughly 10 days apart in the same cramped room beside the cold storage warehouse, every word Carmine Russo spoke was carried back to the greenhouse, clear enough to capture every breath. Night after night, Liam sat beside the small recorder and listened again and again to the voice he had known for 30 years. The voice of his sworn brother selling off each part of the family's body. Here is the layout of the northern docks along with the patrol schedule. Here are the 3 transportation routes and the name of every guard stationed along them. Here is the list of capos, with notes identifying which ones can be bought and which ones must be replaced. Everything will be transferred quietly once I officially take the chair. In return, the Corvino family will stand behind me if anyone inside the organization dares object. Liam listened with one hand clenched against the wooden table, because killing a crime lord, within the harsh world into which he had been born, was at least a crime that could be understood. Power had always changed hands through blood, but selling family secrets to an ancestral enemy, selling the lives of the very brothers who had sworn loyalty to him, offering the flesh and bones of nearly 100 people as a welcoming gift, was, under the unwritten code every Falcone generation learned before it learned scripture, a crime even greater than murder, the one offense for which there was no pardon and no possibility of release. If the 12 capos seated around the long table heard even half of that recording, they would tear the traitor apart with their own hands without waiting for anyone's command. But the recording from the third meeting was what made Liam, listening alone at midnight, reach over and switch off the machine, sit motionless in the darkness for a long while, then rewind and play it again to make certain his ears hadn't deceived him. It came near the end of the meeting, when Corvino's grandson, his voice softened by alcohol, asked with mocking curiosity, "And what about that beautiful sister-in-law of yours, Russo?" "The grieving widow who gives her everything. All the documents are in her name. Are you planning to divide the kingdom with a woman?" Carmine laughed. That dry nasal laugh Liam had heard 1,000 times throughout his life, and once believed was the laughter of his brother, then answered casually, almost indifferently, as though discussing an object nearing the end of its usefulness. "The widow? Don't worry. She only needs to live long enough to sign the remaining transfer papers. Once she signs, she'll be nothing but another name on a second gravestone. A woman who betrayed one husband will betray the next. I don't build houses on ground that has already sunk." Liam sat for a long time in the darkness of the greenhouse with the recording in his hand, and what made him shudder wasn't the fate already prepared for the woman who had poisoned him, but the realization that he was finally skiing all the way to the bottom of Carmen's soul. Carmen hadn't betrayed him for Renata. He hadn't done it for love, and perhaps not even entirely for money. He had betrayed him because betrayal was what he was, a man who saw everyone around him, brother, lover, ally, as nothing more than another step beneath his feet. Liam placed that second recording inside a separate tin box apart from all the other evidence, and said nothing to Aldo, nothing to anyone yet, because the instincts of a man raised among human chessboard bolts told him that this dagger wasn't meant to be used for stabbing. It was planned to be placed in exactly the right position, at exactly the right moment, between two people who still believed they were allies. The following night, Liam came to the apartment on Taylor Street, by the way of the wooden staircase in the back alley. His first visit since Luna had left the greenhouse. The stated reason was that he had brought a few documents and needed her to identify Tommy's handwriting, but the truth, which he wouldn't admit even to himself, was that he needed to sit in a room where another human voice could be heard. They sat at the small dining table beside the window, overlooking the yellow lights of Taylor Street. Luna made ginger tea, and her stomach now curved visibly beneath her sweater. When she asked directly what both Marta and Emilio had avoided asking, "When are you going to act, and what are you going to do to them?" Liam remained silent for a long time before answering with the naked truth. "Under the laws of my world, Luna, all I have to do is play those recordings before the 12 capos. I wouldn't even need to give an order. I wouldn't need to lift a finger. The old law would take care of everything on its own. It has worked that way for 3 generations. Fast, clean, and with no appeal. My father would have done it. My grandfather would have done it. And this entire city waiting for me to do exactly the same." Luna set down her teacup, both hands wrapped around it, as though searching for warmth. She didn't object. She didn't plead. She didn't lecture him about right and wrong. She only lowered her eyes toward her stomach for a moment, then looked directly into his face and asked in a very quiet voice the question Liam would later understand had thrown a switch on the rest of his life. "Sir, I only want to ask one thing. After that, whatever you decide to do, I won't dare stand in your way. Do you want my daughter to grow up in a world where justice is a bullet fired in the dark, or in a world where evil people are forced to live for a very long time, and pay for what they did in front of everyone? Because if justice is a bullet, sir, then I'll tell you the truth. The person who fires it has to hide in the darkness just like the person who dies, and this child will grow up inside the very same darkness that killed her father." Liam didn't answer that night. He returned to the greenhouse shortly before dawn and sat before 3 things, placed side by side upon the wooden table. The family ring that had passed through 3 generations resting on his hand, Tommy Ward's brown notebook, and the tin box containing the recordings. 3 inheritances, 3 roads. The struggle inside him was nothing like some noble private speech. It was a brutal wrestling match between 3 generations of blood that had taught him traitors must pay with their bodies, that allowing them to live was weakness, an invitation to every future betrayer, and the memory of a tiny foot kicking against his palm through faded fabric. It wasn't until the first light entered through the vine-covered glass that Liam finally stood, called Aldo, and spoke the words the elderly attorney would later confess he had waited 40 years to hear from someone carrying the Falcone name. Aldo closed the entire case according to federal standards. The poison, the forged signatures, the insurance policy, the shell companies, the Southside recordings, everything. We aren't going to judge them under my father's law anymore. We're going to judge them under the laws of the United States. The other end of the line remained silent for 3 seconds before the old man's voice returned, deep and steady. I need 4 days, and I know whose door to knock on. There's a federal prosecutor in the Northern District of Illinois who specializes in organized crime. For 15 years, 3 generations of bosses, from both South Side and the North Side, haven't managed to buy him so as lunch. Once this file reaches his hands, there will be no turning back. Are you certain, young master? Liam looked through the glass toward the great house glowing at the edge of his vision. Certain. The final link that had to be secured before the case could be delivered was the testimony of the man who had signed the death certificate. And that task was given to Emilio, who brought 2 things to Dr. Halloran's private office at closing time. One was a copy of the toxicology results from the out-of-state laboratory. The other was an analysis Emilio had written himself as a physician, identifying every medical impossibility in the death certificate Halloran had signed. The elderly doctor read both sets of papers in silence, his hands trembling more with every page. Then he removed his glasses and buried his face in his palms. When he looked up again, Emilio no longer saw the dignified family physician of 15 years sitting before him. He saw only a broken old man. They had my son's gambling debt, Emilio. They told me all I had to do was sign 1 piece of paper for a man who was already dead anyway. I knew it was wrong. I knew from the moment I placed my stethoscope against your brother's chest. His heartbeat was terrifyingly slow, but it was still there, and I signed anyway. I'm old now. I don't want to die as an accomplice. Let me meet your attorney. I'll tell him everything. 3 days later, an unpaged sworn statement bearing Dr. Halloran's signature rested inside Aldo's case file, the final piece. The signal to begin came on Sunday evening through Marta, who asked to speak in person rather than send a message. Standing in the middle of the greenhouse, she delivered the news in the voice of someone reporting from a battlefield. The main house has received the invitations, young master. Mr. Russo has summoned all 12 capos to a formal family gathering this Thursday evening in the private dining room of the restaurant on Taylor Street. The stated purpose is to honor your memory and discuss the future stability of the family, but I heard from the serving staff that they've been ordered to prepare the full ceremony, including the rarest vintage wine, and the mistress will attend. She'll bring your ring on a velvet tray and present it to your successor before them all. The greenhouse fell silent after those words. Emilio let out a curse. Aldo removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly. Only Liam remained perfectly still. For a long time, he stood looking through the glass toward the lights of the house that had once been his. Then he turned around, and for the first time in many weeks, something almost resembling a smile appeared on the face of the man who had already died once. Thursday, he said. They chose Thursday, the night I went to that restaurant every week for 8 years. Very well. We go in on Thursday. Thursday arrived beneath a leaden gray sky hanging low over the rooftops of Taylor Street, the kind of light that belonged neither to day nor evening, and forced the restaurant lamps to be turned on early. In the small apartment upstairs, Liam Falcone stood before the wardrobe mirror, fastening each button of a white shirt before slipping into the black suit he had asked Mr. Moreau to preserve rather than destroy. The same suit they had dressed him in for his funeral, now cleaned and pressed smooth. The moment Luna saw him wearing it, she understood that this wasn't thrift or convenience. It was a message. This man intended to walk into that meeting in the very clothes they had buried him in, so every pair of eyes in the room would understand exactly where the figure standing before them had come from. Downstairs, behind the red velvet curtain, the private dining room had already entered its ritual. 12 capos had gathered around the long walnut table, men as hard as stone seated according to rank. Candles burned along the table in the old tradition. The rarest vintage wine had been poured, and at the head of the table, in the chair only one man had occupied for 8 years, Carmine Russo stood in a silver-gray suit, nearing the end of a carefully prepared speech. His voice was deep and warm with grief when he spoke of his fallen brother, then solemn with responsibility as he declared that the family couldn't remain without someone at the helm for even a single day. At his right stood Renata Falcone in flawless widow's black, holding a small velvet tray in both hands. Upon it rested a replica gold ring, identical to the one engraved with the falcon crest of 3 Falcone generations. Since the original ring had mysteriously vanished with her husband's body, Renata had quietly ordered this counterfeit to complete the transition of power, waiting for the final ritual. The widow would present the ring. The 12 capos would approach one by one and kiss it upon the hand of their new boss, and the dynasty would change rulers without spilling a single drop of blood. Carmine had just lowered himself onto one knee, according to custom, and reached toward the tray when the oak doors of the private dining room opened. They weren't struck or kicked. They simply opened beneath a slow and steady force, both panels separating to either side, and framed against the golden light from the outer dining room stood a man in a black suit. He remained silent, then stepped inside, one measured step after another, the soles of his shoes striking the wooden floor, with perfect clarity through a room that had stopped breathing. Time inside the private dining room shattered in separate fragments of reaction, each later remembered differently by the men who witnessed it. Old Sal from the docks was the first to recognize that face, and his collused hand rose automatically to make the sign of the cross, while his lips shaped the name of a saint in Italian. The youngest capo knocked an entire glass of red wine across the white tablecloth, and no one, not even the man himself, made any attempt to set it upright. The wine spread like an open wound across the fabric. Someone at the far end of the table whispered the name of God. Another man shoved his chair nearly 2 feet backward, as though distance might protect him from a ghost. Carmine Russo froze with one knee still touching the floor, his hand suspended in the air only a handspan from the ring. And Renata didn't scream. That much had to be said for her nerves. She simply turned white inch by inch from her forehead down to her throat, as though someone were draining the blood from inside her. The velvet tray began to tilt in her hands, slowly, steadily, until the fake gold ring rolled from it, dropped onto the wooden table, spun several times in the absolute silence, and finally came to rest. No one picked it up. Liam walked the full length of the room through that silence, passing 12 faces turned to stone, until he reached the head of the table. He did not touch the counterfeit. Instead, he calmly raised his right hand, letting the candlelight flash against the genuine Falcone family ring already resting on his finger, the ultimate proof of his identity. He stared coldly at the fake ring on the table, then brushed it aside like a piece of worthless copper. Only then did he raise his eyes and look around the room. When he spoke, his voice wasn't loud. It was even lower than Carmen's speech had been, yet inside that room it struck like a hammer against stone. "Sit down, all of you. The family meeting you were invited to attend will proceed. The only difference is that I will preside over it," and they sat. 12 men of steel lowered themselves into their chairs like schoolboys. Carmine rose awkwardly from his kneeling position and retreated to the chair on Liam's right through an instinct for self-preservation. Renata sank into her seat, still clutching the empty velvet tray in both hands. Liam began speaking without introduction or lament. He presented the facts as though reciting an indictment he had committed to memory, slowly, clearly, in chronological order. "You were told that I died of heart failure. The truth is that the wine served to me on the night of my anniversary contained a compound that causes muscular paralysis and cardiac arrhythmia. The independent toxicology results from an out-of-state laboratory are now part of the case file. I regained consciousness inside the coffin placed in the center of the chapel. Throughout the visitation, I heard every prayer and every cry, and I also heard the words that were never intended for a living man." He paused for exactly 1 beat, turned his face directly toward Renata, and returned a single sentence to her without raising his voice. "No one will ever know. That is what you whispered beside my coffin, madam. You were wrong by 1 person. Then he looked away from her collapsing face and continued as though she no longer deserved another second of his attention. 3 months before the anniversary party, my will and emergency power of attorney were replaced with forged documents. My signature was reproduced with considerable skill. The beneficiary of a $12 million life insurance policy was changed. The handwriting examination has been completed. Over the past 18 months, More than $2 million has been removed from this family's businesses through 3 shell companies. Every payment order carried the authorized signature of the man seated at my right. Every movement of that money was recorded in full by one person. At that point, Liam's voice changed for the first time, growing slower and heavier. His name was Thomas Ward. He was 27 years old, one of our accountants, the young man with glasses some of you may have passed in the hallway. He discovered everything. He requested a meeting with me so he could report it. 2 days before that meeting, he died on the highway in a staged accident. He was murdered, gentlemen. Murdered because he performed his duty with honesty, while this family sent a funeral wreath for him as though he were nothing more than another number. The room had become so silent that the burning candles could be heard. At some point, all 12 pairs of eyes had left Liam and fixed themselves upon Carmine Russo, who sat motionless while beads of sweat crawled down his temples. It was then, when the entire weight of the room had gathered upon a single point, that Liam calmly reached into the inner pocket of the suit in which they had once laid him out for burial and placed a small black recorder upon the walnut table. "There's one more matter," he said, his voice as light as a man about to finish an idle story. "This is something even the lady beside us hasn't heard." Liam's finger pressed the button, and the small black recorder played a single, continuous audio file. First, Carmine Russo's voice spilled into the room, detailed and cold as he sold the family's secrets to the Corvino clan, laying out the patrol schedules, transportation routes, and the names of the capos to be replaced. Then, without a single second of silence, the recording transitioned to the final, devastating conversation where Carmine dismissed Renata as a mere pawn, his dry nasal laugh echoing through the speaker as he declared that the beautiful widow only needed to live long enough to sign the papers before becoming nothing but another name on a second gravestone, because a woman who betrayed one husband would surely betray the next. The recording stopped. For 1 second, exactly 1 second, Renata Falcone was no longer the woman of steel who had performed the role of grieving widow before hundreds of eyes. She sat with her eyes wide and her lips parted without sound, wearing the face of someone who had looked down and discovered that the ground beneath her feet had never existed, the velvet tray slipping from her lifeless fingers to fall soundlessly onto the carpet. Around her, the 12 capos reacted as one to the double betrayal they had just witnessed. Old Sal did not shout, but simply rose slowly, lifted his glass of wine, and poured it onto the floor beside Carmine's chair, the ancient ritual for someone already dead to the family. One after another, without a word, 12 affairs turned away, closing like a wall of stone against the traitor, and leaving Carmine completely isolated in the breathless room. Liam, standing at the head of the table, saw that moment the final remnant of the human being inside her flickered and went out, because what rose in its place was naked survival. Renata sprang from her chair and spun toward Carmine, her scream tearing through the room. "You animal, you were going to kill me too. I did everything you told me." Then she turned toward Liam, toward the 12 backs already beginning to turn again at the spectacle, and her confessions burst from her like water through a broken dam. No one had asked her a question. No one needed to. It was him. He put the poison in the wine. He gave me the vial and told me to use only half the dose so it would look like heart failure. He arranged the highway crash. He killed the accountant. He was driving the truck that night. "I only signed the papers, I swear. I only signed some documents." Carmine roared at her to shut her mouth. "You insane bitch. You're digging both our graves." But it was already too late. It had been too late for a very long time. The 2 conspirators stood in the middle of the room tearing each other apart with accusations. Each sentence another nail driven into their own coffins before 12 witnesses any prosecutor in America would have dreamed of possessing. At that exact peak of mutual incrimination, Liam Falcone made a single gesture, striking the walnut tabletop twice with a sharp, precise click that ended their shouting like a judge's gavel. Instantly, the red velvet curtain was swept aside, and federal agents, who had been monitoring the entire transmission from just outside the door to secure an airtight arrest, entered the room in swift, professional formation. Armed with the out-of-date toxicology reports, the forged financial documents, and now a room full of witnessed, self-recorded confessions, the officers read the warrants and locked the handcuffs with 2 heavy metallic clicks, without a single weapon needing to be raised. Carmine was led away first. He looked back only once, searching for Liam's eyes, and found a face with nothing left to give him. When Renata's turn came, she passed the head of the table, where her husband stood, and paused for half a heartbeat. Her lips trembled as though she meant to say something, perhaps his name, perhaps a plea. No one would ever know, because Liam spoke first, not looking at her, but at the candle burning in the center of the table, his voice so low and level that the entire room had to hold its breath to hear every word. I could have given you a bullet under the old law. It would have been quick, and perhaps you deserved something that quick. But a bullet would be forgiveness granted too soon. So no, you will live. You will live for a very long time inside a box, just as I once lay inside mine. There will be only one difference. He raised his eyes, and that was the last time Renata Falcone ever saw the eyes of her husband. When I was inside my box, someone still came to weep beside it. Then they were taken away. The velvet curtain closed, and only the faint sound of burning candles remained inside the room, along with 12 men who rose one by one without waiting for an order and formed a long line before the head of the table. Beginning with old Sal, the eldest, each man bowed and pressed his lips to the falcon ring on the hand of the man who had returned from the dead. As the seasons turned and the storm finally settled, the city gradually grew accustomed to the news of the man who had returned from the dead, and the two conspirators now waiting behind the bars of a federal detention center for the day they would stand trial. For those who had lived through it, however, those were 4 months of a strange and unfamiliar peace that each of them had to learn to believe was real. In the middle of autumn, when the oak trees surrounding the Lake Forest estate began turning gold, Luna went into labor at 3 o'clock in the morning, her pregnancy coming to its natural full term, as though nature itself had kept an appointment. Marta made the call. She had moved in with Luna for the final month, not under anyone's orders, but simply because she had decided that was where she belonged. 15 minutes later, Liam's car was parked outside the hospital where Emilio worked, and over the hours that followed, the maternity ward witnessed a sight no capo on the north side could ever have imagined. The man who had entered a family council wearing the suit in which he had been prepared for burial, without his heartbeat changing by a single beat, the man who had listened to the details of his own murder plot without allowing his hands to tremble, now paced the corridor beside the rows of plastic chairs like a caged animal, twisting his hands together and stopping a nurse every few minutes to ask the same question. When Emilio, dressed in surgical scrubs because he was on duty that night, placed a hand on his brother's shoulder and told him, "Sit down, Liam. The mother is healthy. Everything is progressing normally. You're making my staff nervous." Liam sat down, remained seated for exactly 4 minutes, then rose and began pacing again. Emilio, for the first time since the false funeral, laughed until tears came to his eyes when he discovered that the feared crime lord had been wearing his shoes on the wrong feet ever since leaving the house. The first cry came at 11:20 in the morning, passing through the delivery room door, thin, clear, and miraculously fierce, and Liam Falcone stopped in the middle of the corridor as though someone had suddenly turned the entire world back onto its proper axis. When the midwife opened the door with a smile and invited the family inside, he entered the room filled with autumn sunlight and saw Luna, her hair damp with sweat, her face exhausted yet brighter than it had ever been in her life, holding a tiny living being wrapped in a white blanket. She looked up at him and spoke in a voice that still trembled. "A daughter, sir. A little girl." They had discussed the name weeks earlier, one evening in the Taylor Street apartment, when Luna asked him how Italians named their children, and Luna herself had chosen it. She said the baby had been conceived during the darkest days of her life, when she had believed there was nothing left for her, and so the child should carry the name of a star, a reminder that the stars were clearest when the sky was darkest. Stella. That day, on the birth certificate the nurse brought to the bedside, beneath the name Stella appeared. The middle name Liam had asked permission to add, the fulfillment of one final promise. Ward. Stella Ward Hartley. So that the child would grow up carrying the name of the father she had lost, the honest accountant whom the entire city had come to know during the past 4 months, no longer as a brief report about an accident, but as the first man brave enough to follow the truth. When Luna saw that name on the paper, she began to cry, not with the tears of the previous 4 months, but with the final tears of a debt that had at last been paid. Then she did something that brought the entire room into silence. She lifted the white bundle and held it toward Liam. "Hold her." The man stepped back half a pace, and the hands that had once signed orders capable of making an entire city tremble suddenly became two unfamiliar, helpless things. "I've never held one," he said. "I'm afraid I'll hurt her." But Emilio had already moved behind him, adjusting his elbows and supporting his wrists, and then Stella Ward Hartley, weighing 7 pounds and 1 ounce, rested securely in the arms of the final crime lord of the North Side, impossibly small and impossibly warm. When the child stirred, one tiny hand slipped from the blanket, and fingers as delicate as blades of grass curled around his index finger, gripping it with all the strength of a life only 11 hours old. Liam Falcone, who hadn't shed a single tear inside his coffin, hadn't cried when he heard his wife plotting his murder, and hadn't cried when brother took his childhood away from him, stood in that sunlit room and wept, silently and without restraint, for the first time since his father's funeral 15 years earlier. He bent low, pressed his lips to the baby's tiny wreathed forehead, fragrant with milk, and whispered words meant for no one else in the room to hear, only for the child. "I promise you, Stella, you'll grow up without ever having to learn that silence is the price of survival. You'll never have to make yourself invisible to remain safe. This world will have to listen when you speak. I swear it." 1 week later, when mother and daughter were strong enough to leave, Liam collected them from the hospital. But the car didn't return to the Taylor Street apartment. Instead, it turned through the service gate of the Lake Forest estate, followed the familiar gravel road beneath the brilliant golden oaks, and stopped before the old greenhouse, except it was no longer old. During the previous 4 months, in complete secrecy, the glass walls had been replaced, the roof restored, and the room that had once smelled of damp earth had become a small, warm home with a fireplace, a kitchen, and a nursery painted pale yellow, where a wicker cradle stood beside a window overlooking the garden. Liam placed a newly made brass key in Luna's hand and spoke with the awkwardness of a man who had rehearsed the words many times but still didn't know how to say them. "This is where you saved me, where you taught me how to hold a spoon again. Now it belongs to you and Stella. The deed is in both your names without conditions. As for me," he paused, looking down at the key in her hand rather than into her eyes. "Whether I'm ever allowed to cross this doorway is for you to decide. Not today. Not because you owe me anything. Live here. Build your life. Choose whenever you're ready to choose." Then he stood there, the most powerful man in the city, waiting like a beggar outside the door of his own home, until Luna, holding her daughter in her arms, studied him for a long moment. Instead of answering, she placed the key back into his palm, closed his fingers around it, and said, "Then open the door. Our home is getting cold, and Stella needs the fire." More than a year after that Thursday night, when the oak leaves at Lake Forest began turning gold once again, the final sentences were handed down in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. Carmine Russo received life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole for the murder of Thomas Ward, conspiracy to commit murder, and federal racketeering offenses. People said he didn't speak a single word throughout the sentencing hearing, but merely stared down at his own hands. Renata Falcone received 22 years for conspiracy, document forgery, and insurance fraud. The confession she had poured out before 12 witnesses that night closed every door through which she might have attempted to deny her guilt. Dr. Halloran permanent medical license and was sentenced to 6 years in prison. His 9-page sworn statement and his cooperation with the investigation were recognized by the court as mitigating circumstances for a man who had finally chosen to turn back. The Corvino family, a name that had once cast its shadow across the entire South Side, gradually collapsed beneath the widening federal investigation that began with the recordings made inside the fish market cold storage warehouse. The strange thing was that the city didn't fall into the chaos everyone had feared, because in the north, an old empire was transforming itself in a way no one had ever seen before. Liam Falcone dismantled every dark corner of the family's operations in an orderly manner, transferring everything into a chain of restaurants and legitimate logistic and transportation companies subjected to independent audits. The 12 elderly capos were given a choice: retire with honor or step into honest work beneath the light, and most of them chose the light. On Taylor Street, beside the old restaurant, a small office opened in the spring beneath a brass sign engraved with the words, "The Tommy Ward Foundation." Each year, it awarded scholarships in accounting and law to impoverished students throughout the city, young people like the bespectacled boy from years before, who had believed that careful handwriting and honest ledgers were the only capital available to those who had nothing else. The woman who ran that foundation, interviewing every student and reading every application, was Luna Hartley, the maid from years ago who now stood for donors at fundraising events, with a voice that no longer trembled. Marta oversaw the great mansion, which now glowed with a different kind of light, warmer and filled with more laughter from the people who worked there. Emilio returned fully to his hospital and came to Lake Forest only on weekends, in the role everyone in the family openly acknowledged as the only person capable of putting Stella to sleep faster than her own mother. Aldo Ferrante, after completing the final case of his legal career, announced his retirement. Though everyone knew he had retired only to accept a new full-time position, he had appointed himself honorary grandfather. Every afternoon he could be found sitting beside the cradle and reading aloud to the little girl, sometimes a fairy tale, and sometimes to the tearful laughter of the entire household, a chapter from the Civil Code delivered with the rise and fall of a bedtime story. One autumn evening at sunset, Liam Falcone walked along the familiar gravel road he had traveled throughout his life. Except this road no longer led toward long tables, where men bowed their heads in silence. It led toward the greenhouse glowing with sunlight at the end of the garden, where, through the new glass walls, he could see Luna bending over the flower beds she had planted with her own hands, and inside the pale yellow room, Stella slept peacefully in the wicker cradle beside the window. One tiny hand still curled into a fist, just as it had been on the first day she wrapped it around his finger. He remained beside the doorway for a long time, thinking about the walnut coffin, the scent of lilies, and the whisper spoken years ago beside its lid. No one will ever know, she had said, and she had been only half right. It was true that no one knew, not one person in that powerful world of men carrying guns and women wearing jewels. Only one person knew, a pregnant maid whom everyone in the mansion had looked through as though she were air. And in the end, the person the entire world refused to see had been the one who saw the truth more clearly than anyone else. Because sometimes, to recognize the light, a person must first be someone accustomed to standing in the darkness. This is where the story comes to an end, and if it leaves anything behind in your hearts, perhaps it is this simple truth. Never judge a person's worth by the uniform they wear or the work they perform. The person who cleans your home and the quiet accountant sitting in the corner of an office both possess dignity and courage, and either of them may be carrying a truth that the most powerful people fail to see. The kindness we offer when another person is suffering may one day return to save us in a way no one could ever have imagined. And the most enduring form of justice isn't found in the darkness of hatred, but in the light where those who commit evil must face the truth before the eyes of the world, and where honest people are finally given back their names. Dear viewers, how did this story make you feel? Have you ever met someone who seemed invisible, yet carried a great heart and a powerful truth within them? Please share the feelings deepest in your heart in the comments below. We truly hope to read every thought and every personal story you choose to leave with us. And if today's story touched you, please press the like button, share it with your family and friends, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the compelling and meaningful stories we bring you every day. Tomorrow, we will tell you 2 new stories, one about an elderly father abandoned by his own children and an ending that forced an entire city to bow its head, and another about a night shift nurse who discovered a devastating secret inside her own husband's medical records. Believe us, you won't want to miss them. Finally, we wish every one of you watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace and serenity each day beside the people you love. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next